In 1458, Prince Henry had a visit from his nephew, Alfonso V, who was now the King of Portugal. An impetuous young man of 27, he was far more interested in war and glory than he was in exploration. If he had had the money to do so, he would have led a crusade to the far ends of the Mediterranean. As it was, he had to content himself by fighting against the Moors in North Africa, where he was to win 3 victories and gain the title of El Africano. Alfonso V was happy to see his uncle and to have a look at the place where the old man had lived and worked for so many years. Hidden away like a saint or a hermit, he fell in readily with Prince Henry's desire to send to Venice and have a map of the world made showing all the most recent discoveries. This task was entrusted to Fra Mauro, a Franciscan monk, one of the most celebrated cartographers of his day. A year later, when the map came, it was all that Prince Henry had hoped it would be. All the information that he had collected was there, and also all that had been reported about Asia and China by the traveler Marco Polo of Venice. Although Marco Polo had crossed Asia more than 150 years before, his book was still the most recent knowledge that Europeans had about the Orient. With the map came a letter to Prince Henry from the Doge, or ruler, of Venice, who wrote that he hoped Prince Henry would find in the work of Fra Mauro further inducement to carry on with his explorations. Prince Henry needed no further inducement to carry on his exploration. One thing that was most encouraging to learn from both Cadamosto and Diogo Gomez was that below Cape Verde, the coastline of Africa definitely turned eastward. Next year might actually see the fulfillment of his hope. One of his caravels might reach India. But his lifespan was running out, and he knew it. In the summer of 1460, he made many final arrangements. Diogo Gomez, his good friend, was with him and wrote of his last days. In the late autumn of 1460, when the caravels were home from Africa and the islands, and their sails were furled, Prince Henry's life came to an end. Gomez wrote, "King Alfonso and all the people of Portugal mourn the death of so great a prince." In his will the prince had left instructions that he should be buried as he had lived, quietly and simply. On his tomb were carved the words of his motto, "The power to do well." Christopher Columbus was 9 years old in the autumn of 1460 when Prince Henry the Navigator died. On almost any bright morning, the red-haired boy might have been seen running down a narrow street of Genoa, leaving behind the dark house with its clacking loom and heading for the wide open harbor. His feet barely touched the cobblestones. He was so eager to see the big galley that had just come in. Anchored at one of the busy wharves was a galley just in from the eastern end of the Mediterranean. Its 3 tall pointed sails were already furled, the oars banked, and it was being unloaded. Sailors were coming ashore with bags and barrels out of the hold. The boy watched for a chance to slip aboard and to peer about. The air was tinged with the most delicious smell, the scent of spices. Spices, he knew, came from a land called India, and they were hard to get and very costly. Pepper was almost as good as gold. A small bag of peppercorns, his father said, would make a man rich. The galley was armed. It had to be because of pirates. What a thrill it would be to sail on a voyage and to have a look at what there was to be seen. Why should he have to sit in an old courtyard carding wool and learning to be a weaver, when what he wanted to be was a sailor as soon as he was old enough? So far his only sailing had been on one of the little packets that carried wine, cheese, and wools to towns along the coast both ways from Genoa. Ships from faraway lands often came into the harbor of Genoa. He wanted to see the places they came from, all the lands and seas and harbors of the world. He knew all the ships. He knew the cut of their sails, the shape of their prows, and how high they rode above the water. The Mediterranean galleys were long and slim, with triangular pointed sails. The Spanish galleon were high and heavy, with square sails and 3 masts. The Portuguese caravel had pointed sails set at an angle, like the wings of a gull, and flew like a bird across the water. He had heard a map-maker say that on these caravels the Portuguese sailors had gone farther out into the Atlantic than any other sailor, and farther down the coast of Africa, too. Maps were always being made in Genoa for these Portuguese explorers. How much farther would they or could they go? What would they find? What would there be to see? How he longed to go and see every part of the world. Some of the old weather-beaten seamen who had been sailing the sea for a lifetime shook their heads in disgust. They knew all they cared to know about this old world. They had seen it growing worse every year. Another boy born in Genoa, just a year older than Columbus, also was to wonder if ships could reach India by sailing west. Giovanni Caboto was his name. John Cabot in English. Until he was 11, Giovanni had lived in Genoa. Then his father moved to Venice. Young John was soon sailing back and forth across the Mediterranean on one or another of the many Venetian galleys belonging to the merchant fleet. Picking up spices from Arab traders in various ports, he began to wonder exactly where in India those valuable spices came from, how the Arabs got them, and how they brought them to the Mediterranean. Years later, as Columbus was to sail for Spain, John Cabot was to sail for England.